John Avery was no mere pirate. He was a former Royal Navy lieutenant, a man whose ambitions far exceeded the confines of a modest naval career. In 1695, commanding the frigate Fancy, Avery carried out what became known as the greatest pirate raid in history. He attacked and captured the Ganj-i-Sawai, the flagship of the Mughal fleet, laden with gold, silver, and jewels worth the equivalent of 130 million today. Overnight, Avery transformed from a rebellious officer into the wealthiest and most wanted man on the planet, dubbed the King of Pirates, his name becoming a symbol of defiance against imperial power. Following this dazzling triumph, he vanished without a trace, giving rise to legends of a secret pirate kingdom in Madagascar, a marriage to an Indian princess, and a life of unparalleled luxury. But what if I told you that this romanticized tale, from beginning to end, was merely a smokescreen? What if John Avery didn't just disappear, but masterfully staged his own oblivion, becoming the greatest deceiver to ever sail the seas? To understand the architect of this grand deception, one must delve into the world that shaped him and the deep cracks that formed within his soul long before he became the King of Pirates. John Avery was born in the mid-17th century in Devon, a county steeped in maritime history and the salty tang of the sea. He was part of a generation for whom the ocean was not merely a horizon, but an inevitable destiny. Yet, while many saw the sea as a path to glory and riches, Avery, it seems, perceived it from the outset as an arena for a more complex game, a game where his true ambitions would collide with harsh reality. His service in the Royal Navy, beginning in the late 1680s, was not just a career move. It was a period where his character was forged and his worldview shaped. The Navy of that era was a world of harsh discipline, meager pay, and deep-seated corruption, where merit often went unrewarded and promotion depended on connections rather than talent. Young Avery undoubtedly observed this from within, witnessing how the system he swore allegiance to devoured its own sons. His disillusionment was not an instantaneous explosion, it was a slow-burning fire, fueled by injustice and the realization that his potential would never be realized within the established rules. He was no ordinary sailor dreaming of easy plunder. He was a man who saw the flaws in the system and began formulating a plan to turn them to his advantage. The turning point, the point of no return, was his service aboard the frigate Charles II, a vessel chartered to protect Spanish interests from French privateers. The crew, unpaid for months, suffered from hunger and hardship. The captain, mired in debt, was either unwilling or unable to address their grievances. In this atmosphere of desperation and resentment, Avery, already known for his charisma and leadership qualities, didn't just incite a mutiny, he orchestrated it. In May 1694, while the Charles II lay at anchor in A Coruña, Avery led the rebellion, seizing the ship and renaming it the Fancy. This was not a spontaneous act of desperation, it was the first meticulously planned step on his path to a grand deception, an act that revealed his cold calculation and willingness to cross the line separating law from lawlessness to achieve his true goals. His mutiny, coldly calculated and flawlessly executed, was not an isolated act of desperation. It was merely one stark piece of evidence of the deep crisis gripping the British Empire and the entire maritime world on the cusp of the 18th century. The late 17th century was an era of monumental change and equally grand conflicts. Europe was embroiled in the War of the Grand Alliance, also known as the 9 Years' War, where England and its allies opposed the ambitions of Louis XIV. This protracted, bloody struggle drained treasuries, depleted resources, and strained all state mechanisms to their breaking point. The British Navy, the backbone of imperial power, was in a state of paralysis despite its size. Thousands of sailors serving the crown went months, even years, without receiving their due pay. Corruption ate away at the system from within, like shipworms on an old vessel. Supplies were plundered, officer positions sold, and those who genuinely risked their lives on the front lines were left with nothing. This created fertile ground for unrest and discontent. Discipline was maintained by fear, not loyalty, and any charismatic leader capable of offering an alternative to poverty and disenfranchisement could easily gather desperate men around him. The economic landscape was no less turbulent. While government treasuries were stretched thin and ordinary people barely scraped by, global trade flourished, promising fabulous riches. The vast convoys of the East India Companies, laden with spices, textiles, and jewels, traversed the oceans, representing floating treasuries. These vessels, often poorly protected, became incredibly tempting targets. The line between legitimate privateering, encouraged by the state to harm enemies, and outright piracy blurred beyond recognition. Many former privateers whose commissions had expired or were not renewed simply continued their activities, but now, under the black flag, seeing no fundamental difference. The social atmosphere was permeated with a sense of injustice and the promise of quick enrichment at others' expense. For many people, cornered by poverty and a lack of prospects, the open seas seemed a last refuge where the rules of the old world no longer applied. Far from London's strict laws in the ports of the New World, in Madagascar, and in the secluded coves of the Arabian Sea, a different, often brutal logic prevailed. It was in this fluid environment, where the Crown's authority was merely a shadow and law a vague concept, that ideal conditions formed for those willing to risk everything for unimaginable wealth. It was under such circumstances that John Avery, with his ambitious and cold strategy, was able to find not just followers, but fertile ground for his greatest game. After the mutiny in A Coruña in May 1694, Avery wasted no time. His first strategic move, following the capture of the Charles II and its renaming to the Fancy, was an immediate search for resources and men. He sailed directly to the Canary Islands. There, using his charisma and promises of untold riches, he began attracting desperate sailors, luring them with the promise of freedom from the Crown's oppression and the prospect of easy plunder that they could not find in service. This was the first phase of his meticulously developed plan, assembling a crew willing to follow him to the ends of the earth. The next stage of his audacious venture was a transoceanic journey. The Fancy rounded the Cape of Good Hope and set course for Madagascar, an island that already served as the unofficial capital of the pirate world, a place where the Crown had no real authority. This was not a random route, but a calculated maneuver designed to position him within the richest trade routes of the Indian Ocean, far from the watchful eyes of European powers. In Madagascar, Avery didn't merely rest, he transformed the Fancy into a magnet for other pirate captains. Displaying his resolve, and perhaps already some spoils from opportunistic raids, he managed to assemble an impressive flotilla. 5 other ships joined his flagship, each ready to share the risk and, more importantly, the potential rewards. Their combined target became the annual Mughal pilgrim convoy returning from Mecca, known as one of the wealthiest convoys in the world. In August 1695, off the coast of India, Avery's flotilla intercepted its prey. The first vessel to fall was the Fateh Mohammed, a smaller ship but already laden with gold. Its capture was a mere prelude to the main prize. The true jewel of the convoy was the Ganj-i-Sawai, the flagship, protected by hundreds of soldiers and armed with 80 cannons. The battle was fierce but short and decisive. At a critical moment, one of the Ganj-i-Sawai's cannons exploded, causing panic and disarray aboard. Avery, masterfully capitalizing on the chaos, ordered his men to board. Resistance was broken. What the pirates discovered in the holds surpassed their wildest dreams. Gold, silver, precious stones, silks, and spices, with a total value equivalent to $130 million today. This raid was unprecedented not only in the scale of its plunder, but also in its ramifications. It didn't just make Avery the richest pirate in history, it shook the foundations of global trade and triggered an unprecedented diplomatic crisis between the British Empire and the Mughal Empire. Following the division of the spoils, which some accounts suggest was far from equitable, Avery made his next, equally calculated decision. Instead of returning to known pirate havens, where he would inevitably be hunted, he headed for the Bahamas, then a relatively undeveloped region where he hoped to legitimize some of his wealth and blend in among new settlers. However, this was merely a diversionary tactic. Avery perfectly understood that the world would hunt the king of pirates with unprecedented tenacity. His true goal was not to become an ordinary rich man and settle down. He didn't just disappear, he began meticulously orchestrating his exit from the stage, deliberately creating false trails and spreading rumors of his imminent disappearance or death. He dispersed his crew, sending them on different paths to confuse pursuers and create chaos in the investigation. Some of his former comrades were captured, brought to trial, and executed, but Avery himself seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving only legends in his wake. This phase, following his dazzling triumph, was no less crucial a part of his grand scheme, the masterful staging of his own oblivion, the beginning of his transformation from a living legend into an elusive ghost. His disappearance was no accident. It was the culmination of a unique set of personal qualities and honed methods that John Avery employed throughout his audacious career. He possessed a rare gift of persuasion, an ability that extended far beyond mere command. Avery didn't just give orders, he inspired. For thousands of sailors, exhausted by poverty and injustice, his words were a breath of fresh air, promising a world where their labor would be rewarded, not stolen. He knew how to speak to everyone in their own language, be it a desperate sailor yearning for freedom or an ambitious officer seeking recognition. This charisma was reinforced by his virtuoso manipulation of humanity's strongest passion, the lust for wealth. Avery didn't just promise riches, he painted vivid pictures of absolute financial independence, impossible within the confines of the decaying imperial system. He showed them not just plunder, but freedom, freedom from hunger, from humiliation, from endless unpaid service. This made him not just a captain, but something more, a prophet of a new, more just world where only strength and audacity determined success. He could transform abstract sums into tangible dreams, whether it was their own home or the end of endless wandering at sea. Yet Avery was no fool who surrounded himself only with flatterers. He was a shrewd psychologist, capable of instantly gauging the potential and weaknesses of others. His crew wasn't composed of random cutthroats. He meticulously selected those with the necessary skills: experienced navigators, accurate gunners, fearless boarders. He didn't just hire people, he built an efficient machine where every cog was in place, and every crew member felt not just subordinate, but part of a great common cause, a comrade in this audacious game against the world. He skillfully delegated authority, allowing the best to prove themselves, thereby strengthening their loyalty and sense of belonging. His adaptability was phenomenal. He could instantly change tactics, whether in battle or negotiations, at sea or on land. From a modest lieutenant to a mutineer, from a pirate captain to an elusive phantom, every transition was not an improvisation, but a calculated step. He understood that to achieve his goals, he needed not just to carry out a raid, but to create a story that would live a life of its own. Rumors of his fabulous wealth, his elusiveness, his mysterious disappearance, all were part of a meticulously crafted image-building campaign. He didn't just disappear, he built his myth, transforming himself into a phantom impossible to catch, for he was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. He exploited the very structure of the information landscape of the time, the slow dissemination of news, the lack of verified sources, to manipulate the perception of his fate. He became one of the first to consciously manage his public image, creating around himself not just a veil of mystery, but a labyrinth of false trails and contradictory stories. His entire life, from the mutiny on the Charles II to his final oblivion, was a demonstration not only of unprecedented audacity, but also a profound understanding of human psychology and the mechanisms of power. He was not just a lucky pirate, he was a master of illusion who transformed his life into history's most expensive spectacle, where every move was part of a grand design, and his disappearance merely the final, most ingenious act. However, behind this smokescreen, beyond the mist of legends surrounding his vanishing act, lay real figures whose interests were intricately intertwined with John Avery's audacity. The raid on the Ganj-i-Sawai was not just an act of piracy, it was a powerful catalyst, exposing deep contradictions within the very structure of the British Empire and its relations with powerful Eastern powers. The primary antagonist, whose fury became the driving force behind the unprecedented hunt for Avery, was the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, one of the most powerful rulers of his era. For him, the attack on a pilgrim ship carrying thousands of Muslims and untold riches from sacred Mecca was not just a robbery, it was a direct insult to his authority, his faith, and his people. Aurangzeb, known for his inflexibility, flew into a furious rage. He immediately ordered the blockade of all English trading posts in India, threatening the complete expulsion of the British East India Company from his domains. This was a colossal blow to London's economic interests. The British East India Company, which had by then transformed into a gigantic trading monopoly, effectively governing vast territories and maintaining its own army, found itself between a rock and a hard place. Its profits, its influence, its very existence depended on stable relations with the Mughal Empire. Loss of access to Indian markets would mean financial ruin. Desperate to appease Aurangzeb, the company was forced to take unprecedented measures. It paid the Mughals compensation of 600,000 rupees, an enormous sum, equivalent to millions of pounds sterling at the time, for the damage inflicted by Avery. This was not just compensation, it was an admission of its own impotence and an attempt to save face in the midst of an international scandal. The East India Company's pressure immediately reverberated in London, reaching the highest echelons of power. King William III, facing the threat of diplomatic and economic crisis, could not stand idly by. For the first time in history, a pirate operating outside British waters was outlawed, and a massive bounty of $1,000 was placed on his head, a sum capable of ensuring a comfortable life for several generations. This amount was later doubled. Proclamations for the arrest of Avery and his crew were dispatched worldwide, from the colonies of the New World to the African coasts, transforming the king of pirates into the most wanted criminal on the planet. Paradoxically, this unprecedented hunt revealed those who indirectly benefited from the existence of figures like Avery. While London and Delhi were rattled by diplomatic storms, a shadow economy flourished in distant colonies. Governors such as Nicholas Trott in the Bahamas or Benjamin Fletcher in New York didn't just turn a blind eye to pirate activities, they actively collaborated with them, transforming their territories into safe havens and distribution hubs for stolen goods. The gold, silver, silks, and spices stolen from the Ganj-i-Sawai flooded the black markets of the colonies, enriching local officials, merchants, and anyone willing to transgress the law for quick gain. These patrons of piracy, hidden behind a facade of legality, were the true beneficiaries of the chaos Avery created. They provided him not just refuge, but the infrastructure necessary to legitimize his fabulous wealth. They were part of a corrupt network that was eating away at the empire from within, and it was into this network that Avery, with his grand scheme, seamlessly wove himself, perfectly positioned to expose the full depth of systemic decay. However, the very grandeur of John Avery's scheme, his dazzling triumph, proved to be his Achilles' heel. The unprecedented hunt, launched for the King of Pirates, was no abstract threat. It was real, relentless, and gradually began to bear fruit, exposing the first cracks in his meticulously constructed illusion. Despite all his efforts to conceal his tracks and disperse his crew, members of his crew were not as fortunate as their captain. One by one, or in small groups, Avery's former comrades, who had shared the spoils from the Ganj-i-Sawai, fell into the hands of justice. Accusations of piracy, trials, public executions, all became a series of high-profile spectacles across England and its colonies. Under torture or in exchange for a promise of clemency, some of them gave testimonies that, while not revealing Avery's exact whereabouts, inevitably pointed to one undeniable truth: the legendary pirate king had not died in battle, nor vanished into the depths of the sea. He was alive, and his fabulous wealth, instead of bringing him freedom, became his greatest burden. It was here, at this point, that Avery's final fatal flaw emerged, not a tactical misstep, but a fundamental defect in his ingenious plan. He managed to steal an unimaginable treasure, but failed to consider that the treasure itself would make him a perpetual hostage. The myth of his luxurious life in Madagascar, of a pirate kingdom and an Indian princess, was merely a facade, perhaps deliberately spread by him to divert attention. His true fate, however, was far less romantic and much harsher. Being the most wanted man on the planet meant living in constant fear, in perpetual isolation. Every attempt to spend even a fraction of his millions, every step toward legitimizing his wealth, every contact with the outside world carried the deadly threat of exposure. His freedom, bought at the price of an audacious raid, turned into a prison whose walls were built of gold and precious stones. Thus, the culmination of his piratical career, the capture of the Ganj-i-Sawai, simultaneously marked the beginning of his true downfall. There was no glorious battle, no heroic end, no serene old age in luxury. Instead, John Avery, the man who dared to defy empires, was doomed to a life in the shadows. Historians, meticulously dissecting fragments of evidence, generally agree that he most likely returned to England, perhaps to his native Devon, where he spent the rest of his days under an assumed name, in constant tension, deprived of the ability to enjoy the fruits of his triumph. He became a phantom, not because he vanished, but because his fame, his wealth, and his past transformed him into a living shadow. This was the true unraveling of the King of Pirates myth. His legend lived on, but he himself faded into obscurity, a victim of his own unprecedented success and insatiable greed. However, while empires restructured their control mechanisms, the figure of John Avery himself underwent a different, no less astonishing transformation in the collective consciousness. While the real man, John Avery, withered in the shadow of his own success, his image, paradoxically, only grew stronger. He became not just a pirate, but an archetype, a symbol of audacious defiance, an embodiment of absolute freedom from the crown's dictates and an unjust system. The myth of the King of Pirates living in luxury in Madagascar was far more appealing than the truth of his solitary, paranoid existence. A society weary of corruption and poverty craved such narratives, stories of how an ordinary man could defy powerful forces and emerge victorious, even if the price of that victory was unimaginable. The immense wealth stolen from the Ganj-i-Sawai, equivalent to 130 million today, didn't simply vanish into thin air. Gold, silver, and jewels, instead of settling in one place, flooded the black markets of the colonies, fueling a shadow economy and creating an unprecedented influx of illicit capital. Part of it, undoubtedly, was spent on luxury goods, but a larger portion was likely used to bribe officials, finance new pirate ventures, and establish money laundering networks that existed long after Avery's name became a legend. This was not just plunder, but a powerful financial injector that distorted markets and created a temporary boom in certain port cities that profited from smuggling. For the British East India Company, the raid was a catastrophe that could have led to its complete collapse. Loss of access to Indian markets would mean the collapse of its trading monopoly and the loss of multi-million-pound investments. The payment of 600,000 rupees in compensation was, in essence, an attempt to appease the Mughals and salvage colossal assets. This sum, equivalent to millions of pounds sterling at the time, placed a heavy burden on the company's budget, forcing it into large-scale internal reforms and tightened security measures on trade routes. Investors who had put money into the company's shares faced falling prices and significant losses, which undermined confidence in maritime trade as a reliable source of income and triggered panic on the London Exchange. The British Crown, in the person of King William III, found itself in an extremely delicate position. The threat of a complete rupture of diplomatic and trade relations with the Mughal Empire was unacceptable. To navigate this crisis, London was forced to demonstrate unprecedented resolve in combating piracy. An unheard-of bounty of $1,000, later doubled, was placed on Avery's head, serving as a direct signal to the world the British Empire would no longer tolerate such challenges to its authority. This led to the tightening of maritime law, increased funding for the Royal Navy to patrol trade routes, and, crucially, the beginning of a systematic fight against corruption in colonial administrations that had previously turned a blind eye to piracy. Many governors who had previously patronized sea rovers were recalled or removed from their posts, and their successors received clear instructions to eradicate pirate havens. The financial and political changes were profound. Avery's raid became a catalyst for the transition from an unregulated, often chaotic maritime space to more centralized control. This event forced world powers, primarily Great Britain, to recognize that piracy was not just a local problem, but a direct threat to global trade and the stability of empires. Strategies for protecting sea lanes were revised, and coordination between the navies of various states in combating common enemies was strengthened. Avery's case, among other things, prompted the more active implementation of convoy systems for protecting merchant ships, and also contributed to the development of intelligence networks aimed at identifying and destroying pirate bases. Thus, what began as the audacious attack of one man transformed into a turning point that fundamentally altered the dynamics of maritime trade and international politics, forcing empires to take unprecedented measures to protect their interests and reshape the very concept of naval control. This encapsulates the profound irony of his legacy. A man who masterfully staged his disappearance to evade justice ultimately became a prisoner of his own legend. His actual life lacked the triumph ascribed to him by popular lore, and his wealth, rather than granting freedom, became an eternal burden. The story of John Avery is more than just a chronicle of a pirate raid. It's a profound exploration of human psychology, the power of collective imagination, and how myths emerge from facts, subsequently taking on a life of their own, beyond control. It demonstrates that even the most ingenious plan cannot foresee all its repercussions, particularly when it challenges the foundations of power and public aspirations. Perhaps the most crucial lesson is that true freedom isn't always measured in gold, and genuine influence over minds sometimes belongs not to those who